Hello! Today I'm continuing with my series on the Final Fantasy summons with a look at Phoenix, which recurs in several Final Fantasy games, and most prominently to date in the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI, so proving a slightly more topical summon than those discussed thus far perhaps. Now, Phoenix is an interesting one, because as far as summoning goes, rather than a perpetual existence as a legacy summon, similar to Ifrit or Shiva for example, it has fluctuated between a battle ability, an item, and even an enemy at times, depending on the title. And just to exemplify that, before considering its origins, Phoenix made its summonable debut back in Final Fantasy V, and while it generally persisted as such through the subsequent titles of Final Fantasies VI, VII, and IX, unlike most staple summons, there were instances where it was either absent entirely, such as Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII, which was an Ivalice game, and Final Fantasy XV, or was used in a slightly different way, such as in Final Fantasy VIII, where, like Odin, it is a randomly triggered pseudo-summon that can appear at any time in the game after you've used a Phoenix Pinion in battle. So quite a checkered history there. And moving now into present times, the significance of Phoenix within the realms of Final Fantasy has increased in recent years, with its appearances in Final Fantasy XIV and now Final Fantasy XVI, where it is a much more prevalent story-based summon, and particularly in the latter title, to the extent that it even appears on the game's logo. But taking a step back and looking into the origins of the Phoenix, we can observe precisely how its patchworked, muddled history into popular consciousness has been adapted into the unique worlds of Final Fantasy to very good effect. And kicking off with source material, rather than having a clear-cut cultural origin, like the previously discussed Ifrit or Odin, for example, the Phoenix is an amalgam of several mythologies and cultures, which, like many historic stories or icons, became conflated into a single accepted entity over time, as cultures began to intermingle and trade, and then later, looking at times of artistic and cultural revisionism, such as the Renaissance for example, concepts for things like the Phoenix and mythological creatures became further distilled down into a very singular, iconic thing based on these late artists' impressions. But the earliest accounts and accepted histories attribute the Phoenix to both Greek and Egyptian mythology, where for the latter, the Phoenix was said to be a firebird associated with the sun god Ra, and appeared every few hundred years to indicate good tidings. And for the Greeks, it was a peacock-typed creature that lived out its life before exploding into flames and being born again from the ashes. And indeed, aside from these two commonly cited sources, there's evidence of similar firebirds and regenerative birds, spanning from the Romans, who of course appropriated a lot of Greek culture and stories, but also Japanese, Slavic and Turkic cultures, to name but a few, also have iterations of this sort of creature. So despite the ambiguous origins of the bird, the consistencies remain that it's associated with the sun, and thus life and fire, the fact it dies by bursting into flames, so again connotations of fire, and finally the fact that in some form or another it is born again after it burns, which is its association with resurrection and rebirth. Now, turning to Final Fantasy, we can see that they indulge the concept of the Phoenix in numerous ways, and indeed, even predating the summon itself, we had the renowned resurrection item, Phoenix Down, which revives fallen party members. And digressing slightly, I always thought it was a very strange term, because as a kid I thought it was down, as in a directional sort of thing, and it's quite embarrassing, but it took a number of years for me to realise it actually referred to the soft, downy feathers that are found in a bird's plumage. But aside from the Phoenix Down, we have the Mega Phoenix and Phoenix Pinion, which were introduced in Final Fantasy VIII, and of course finally we have the summon itself, Phoenix, and each of these instances are tied to regenerative status effects within Final Fantasy, and while the summonable being does provide a fire-based attack, usually against all of its opponents, at the same time it often, or in fact perhaps always, revives fallen comrades at the same time, bringing them back into the fray of battle. So we can see that these historical dual associations of both fire and rebirth are used equally across the Final Fantasy mythos. Narratively speaking, it's interesting to see where Phoenix will be taken now, because it has been nudged slightly more to the forefront of story than it has been in the past. And arguably we could say that the beginnings of this were Final Fantasy VII, where we had the Fort Condor sidequest, which sees the old Condor die and then the baby Condor's born. So there's a hint at this rebirth and regeneration sort of vibe, which is where we acquire the Phoenix materia. But of course that's not of strict narrative importance. But shifting into Final Fantasy XVI, this is very interesting to think about, because we have the character Joshua, who is known to be the Phoenix's dominant, and there are rumours around that this kid or someone close may die. And if we take into consideration that Phoenixes are regenerative and rebirth is strongly associated with the creature, it's interesting to think about how that could be applied to the story, because it's certainly not coincidence, and it wouldn't be without purpose, that the Phoenix of all creatures has been elevated to such a degree of prominence in the upcoming game. So there we have it, very short overview there, considering the origins and the applications of the Phoenix motif across Final Fantasy games. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing or check back again for some more Final Fantasy updates and lore episodes soon.